Mr. Finlayson, a member of the Australian House of Representatives, was quoted to have said the following about what had caused the wreck of the St. Paul by the Daily Standard on the 31st of March 1914. Quote, Commander Brewis, who lately inspected the coast of Australia, made a recommendation in regard to improving the lighting of Moreton Bay. He said, and it is unfortunate that no effort has yet been made to guarantee the safety of navigation on our coast, which is notoriously ill-lighted and dangerous navigation.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The swift sinking of the St. Paul.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The St. Paul had been built in 1912 in Britain, but was under the ownership of the French company Naval de l'Océanie. She took her place as part of a 7-ship fleet, all of which were named after saints. The 1,633-ton steamship, with her steel hull and double bottom, had been given an A1 insurance rating and was considered a very good and well-built ship. She was no stranger to the shores of Australia, but was a stranger to Moreton Bay. She had made several voyages to Sydney and had made a voyage from Puget Sound to New Caledonia with a cargo of lumber. Her final visit to Australia began with a charter to tow the bark Clan Macfarlane, newly acquired for use as a hulk, from Auckland to New Caledonia. Once this task was complete, she took on a cargo of 2,400 tons of chrome ore. The cargo was intended for Antwerp, but was not given a voyage that the St. Paul was going to make. She was going to meet with the ship Port Lincoln in Moreton Bay, and the cargo was going to be transferred to the Port Lincoln, meaning that the St. Paul's task was almost complete. For the last 8 months of the St. Paul's career, she was under the command of Captain Corey, who had a reputation for being a careful navigator and a good captain. He had under his command a crew of 26 men, though little was said about how experienced the crew was. The newspapers instead chose to focus on the fact that a majority of the ship's firemen were Middle Eastern. It was also mentioned that some of the crew were from New Caledonia. The St. Paul was primarily a cargo vessel, but she also had 2 passengers on board, Mrs. Carter and her 7-year-old granddaughter Nancy. Were traveling from New Caledonia to visit Mrs. Carter's daughter in Nambour, and they had hired a passage from New Caledonia to Brisbane on board the St. Paul. On a ship where children were not particularly common, it was said that Nancy was swiftly a favorite of the entire crew. It was not a particularly long voyage. The ship departed New Caledonia around noon on the 22nd of March, and on the night of the 26th, they were within sight of Cape Moreton. The weather throughout the entire voyage had been calm and in their favor. As they approached, Chief Officer Jean Saunier asked Captain Corey if he had decided which entrance he intended to make for. Captain Corey said that he had not made up his mind yet, but then steered for the southern entrance. Captain Corey had a chart for the harbor, but this was going to be the first time that the St. Paul or her crew had ever entered it. There was much made in the newspapers directly after the wreck of the St. Paul about how French charts were not as good as the Admiralty charts, and that this had been a factor in what was to follow. Chief Officer Saunier would protest that the French chart of the harbor used by Captain Corey in planning their route looked just the same as the Admiralty chart shown during the inquiry. Further questions did point to at least one difference, though. Brennan Shoal, on the Admiralty chart, was listed as being at 36 feet, but on the French chart, Chief Officer Saunier believed it showed a shallower depth. Since the St. Paul had a draft of 20 feet aft and 17 feet forward, Chief Officer Saulnier believed that this might have impacted the route that Captain Corey took during his approach. A witness from the Cape Moreton lighthouse said that St. Paul's course seemed confused, that the ship had changed its course several times, as though it were not certain which route to take. It was hard for Chief Officer Saulnier to know for certain what the discussion about the route had been, and he had no idea when the light of Moreton Bay had ever been sighted. His watch had ended at 8 in the evening, and he had left the deck and gone to sleep. Captain Corey was now in command of the deck, accompanied by the ship's second officer, Charles Charbonneau. At 11:13 at night, the Cape Moreton lighthouse saw the St. Paul and sent them a signal asking what vessel they were and if they needed a pilot. The response from St. Paul was understood to be a request for a pilot, though this too seems to have not been smooth. Chief Officer Saulnier later admitted that, though all of the officers of the ship had a basic understanding of Morse code, and the ship was equipped with a lantern to signal, none of them were very good with it, and they could not understand if the messages were too fast. Since the St. Paul seemed to have been requesting a pilot, and indeed had slowed her speed to half as though waiting for one, the Cape Moreton lighthouse signaled to the pilot steamer Llewellyn to go get them. The Llewellyn got underway and began to head towards the location of the St. Paul. The watchman and the Cape Moreton lighthouse could not remain watching the St. Paul now that his task to connect them with the pilot ship was complete. But he did make the offhand observation to himself that he thought that they were coming in a little closer to Smith's Rock than was normal. The Llewellyn was still heading towards them, but had not reached them yet when midnight came, and it was time for the watch to change. The first man to come to the deck and take his post was the man who was to take the wheel, and he was given the course instructions from the second mate to steer southwest, but more south than west. Only a moment later, the captain gave an order for hard a port. He did not say anything about why the order was given, but it is possible that he realized their position again and the danger they were in. Less than 5 minutes after the man at the wheel had taken his post, the St. Paul struck on Smith's Rock. The engines were immediately ordered full astern, which investigators would later say was a tragic mistake. If the engines had been kept going forward, the rocks might have kept the ship afloat until rescue could come. But the engines did their work, and the ship was pulled from the rocks. Captain Corey, in that moment, turned to Second Officer Charbonneau and said that he had lost his position. When Chief Officer Saulnier was later asked about what this could have meant, he said that he believed that Captain Corey was talking about how he was likely not to keep his job after having struck a rock. There was very little time for such concerns, though. Chief Officer Saulnier had been called 5 minutes before midnight to wake up and head to the deck to relieve Captain Corey. He was halfway up the ladder leading to the bridge when the ship struck the rock. He rushed the rest of the way up and could see the Llewellyn's lights in the distance, but he could not tell how far away they were. It seemed as though Llewellyn was heading for them, and they had been heading for Llewellyn before the rock had gotten in the way. Second Officer Charbonneau was sent to sound the well, but on his way to do so, was met by the chief engineer who said he had sounded the ballast under the engine room and had found no water. On going forward, Chief Officer Saulnier found that water was instead coming in near the forecastle, and that the St. Paul was quickly sinking at the head. The men who were still in their bunks, and had somehow managed to sleep through the ship striking, were woken up and called to the deck. Captain Corey ordered Greaser Morin to open the whistle in the hopes of calling for help, but there was no steam, so the whistle would not sound. In the meantime, Captain Corey ran to get Mrs. Carter and her granddaughter to the deck while the men prepared the lifeboats. Captain Corey came up from below with the little girl in his arms and handed her to one of the crew members, who then climbed into the smaller lifeboat with her in his arms. Most of the crew said that they had never seen Mrs. Carter come on deck, however. It was later said that Mrs. Carter had turned around to grab more clothes since she was in her nightdress. Captain Corey and second mate Charbonneau went below to bring her up, since the ship was swiftly sinking. Second engineer Courtois had been asleep when the ship had struck, as was the ship's chief engineer. After speaking for a moment with the chief engineer, he ran to the deck to find that the ship was going down. He had run back down to the engine room only to have the chief engineer give him the same information that he had reassured the second officer with. There was no water in the ballast tank. Second engineer Courtois was not reassured. He could see that the engine room floor had developed a slope. He called all of the engine room staff to come to the deck. Somehow, Said Ali, one of the firemen, failed to hear the call. He was shoveling coal in the stokehole when he heard a crash and, on looking up, found huge volumes of water pouring down on him. He tried to reach the ladder, but he was swept off his feet by the water. Fortunately, he was able to grab hold of one of the rungs of the ladder and pull himself up to the relative safety of the upper deck that way. The St. Paul had 2 lifeboats, one large and one small. They started to get the larger boat out, but in the excitement a mistake was made. The crew was ordered to cut through the lashings of the boat, but they accidentally cut the tackle that should have been used to swing the boat out as well, making it painfully slow to launch. The men then turned their attention to the smaller of the lifeboats and began to cut the lashings on her. But even as they were working quickly, the St. Paul gave a sudden lurch and sank beneath their feet. It was only about 5 minutes after the St. Paul had struck the rock that she was no longer able to be seen above the water. Chief Officer Saulnier voiced the opinion that even if the tackle had not been accidentally cut on the larger lifeboat, they would not have had the time to launch her. As the ship took her final plunge, the men who were trying to free the lifeboat tore at her lashings in desperation, but it was no use. The sailor who had Nancy Carter in her arms as the ship went down felt her ripped from his arms by the sudden surge of water, and he was not able to get a hold of her again. He only heard her brief cry in the darkness, and then she was gone. Her grandmother, Captain Corey, and second mate Charbonneau had never returned to the deck, and they were all lost. They were not alone. With no lifeboats, the men found themselves struggling in the water, and not all of them knew how to swim. Knowing how to swim was also not a certain path to survival. It was noted that among the men who were trying to free the boats as the St. Paul went down, 5 who knew how to swim were lost, and 2 who did not know how to swim were saved. For most of the men, they simply grabbed hold of a piece of wreckage and hoped that the Llewellyn would save them. The men in the Llewellyn had been traveling towards the lights that they knew were the St. Paul, only to suddenly see them disappear. Until then, they had not realized that the St. Paul was in distress. No flares or rockets had been used on the St. Paul, but when the lights disappeared, and in such proximity to the known navigational hazard of Smith's Rock, they had assumed the worst. They had rushed to the scene and launched boats, which had pulled the 11 survivors out of the water. The rescue took place only minutes after the ship had sunk, but for the survivors, it seemed like much longer as they floated in the darkness, uncertain of what was going to happen. At 12:40 in the morning, the Llewellyn signaled to the Cape Moreton lighthouse the tragic news of what had occurred, and the news did not take long to spread. There were questions about landing survivors. Only 3 of the men who had been rescued were of European descent, all 3 of whom were from France, and there were concerns raised about whether or not the 8 remaining men would be allowed to land. The question was settled by the collector of customs, who pointed out that the Immigration Restriction Act specifically allowed all victims of a shipwreck to be landed. The men were met with charity workers who saw to it that they were given clothing and lodging until they could be taken by ship to Sydney. None of the rescued men spoke English, but they expressed their gratitude for the rescue and the kindness that they were met with through translators. There was an attempt made to try to retrieve the remains of those who had been lost, but the Llewellyn found the location where the ship had gone down teeming with sharks, one of which even tried to charge the Llewellyn, though it did not cause any damage. No remains were found, and it was believed that the sharks were the reason. The ship's hatch covers and one of the lifeboats, very smashed up, were found about 5 miles from the location of the wreck. While the attention of the owners of the St. Paul turned to salvage, the attention of the population around Moreton Bay and Brisbane turned to how such a disaster could have occurred. The blame was eventually placed on how poorly Smith's Rock was marked as a point of danger. There was new pressure to add a lighted buoy to the navigational hazard, improve the entrance to the harbor, or do something else to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. For more information, please see the Beaudesert Times from April 3, 1914, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.